And let me just start. I've kind of already surfaced that, recently, if folks have read, President Obama recently visited a federal prison. He is the first sitting president ever to visit a prison. It's actually a part of Vice, their show on HBO, where they sit down with him for about an hour and really talk about why he did what he did. And he's been very clear, once he leaves office, this will be an issue that he takes on for a very long time. So what is this issue that we call criminal justice? And so let me start by asking our academic, our community organizer, our voice, who's worked on this issue for a very long time, Dr. Jorja Leap, about the current state of criminal justice, but at the same time, the role that foundations have played, will continue to play, as well as the folks in communities that we care deeply about. Jorja?
Okay, good afternoon. And I'm very interested, I'm ever a researcher as I look out at this crowd and I see, with apologies to a few of you, the preponderance of people that are here this afternoon are female. And this, in and of itself, is a change in terms of criminal justice. Criminal justice has long been the purview of law enforcement and of men. And your presence here is part of a window that is opening. But I think we have to be very clear that this window is opening for a limited amount of time, and it's going to take very intentional and thoughtful action that is not, and I want to stress this, business as usual. And so I'm going to make a couple of statements here. We're going to talk to different folk on the panel, and then we're going to come back to me when I talk about specifics. First of all, we have got to get rid of the idea of criminal justice. It's an oxymoron. It's like saying jumbo shrimp. We need to start thinking about community justice. And it is the role of funders and foundations to lead this work. And once again, not only by the tried and true methods. Now, I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think we've got to look at community justice, and I think we have to look at both rebuilding old pathways and forging new pathways. And those pathways for community justice are going to have to deal with the connections between the traditional criminal justice system, education, the arts, and the grassroots. And it can't be simply that foundations fund innovative new projects, although those are important. Foundations are going to have to drill down into the infrastructure, and that's going to be part of my message today. We have to look at really building coalitions by funding community leaders, by funding youth, by funding individuals who have re-entered the community from prison, and by funding educational systems. We're going to talk about some interesting projects that are doing just that, but the first challenge I am throwing out to everyone here, including us, including nonprofits, including researchers and funders more than anybody, is how are we going to build an infrastructure and a programmatic approach to community justice? How are we going to look at education, the arts, and leadership? So that's sort of my opening gambit. Julio, more, less? What do you think?
Well, you could go on and on and on and on, and I think we've funded you for about 6 years now, so I've heard quite a bit of what you just put together. So no, all kidding aside, Dr. Leap has been instrumental. When we started at the foundation about 7 years ago, there were about 3,000 kids incarcerated any given day in Los Angeles County. I do want to talk about the success that we've been able to cut that rate in half in a short amount of time, and it's folks like Dr. Leap and Alex and Jessica and Benny on this table to really talk about how foundations have played a part in that. And so I really want to thank Dr. Leap for really starting us off and really thinking about how this issue cuts across everything we care deeply about, whether it's housing or education, the arts. It all is interconnected. They're not unrelated factors. And so let me segue to Alex Johnson, Executive Director of Children's Defense Fund, California. I just got back from my conference in Miami, hosted by the Independent Sector Conference, and I kept hearing the phrase equity. There's a conference happening in downtown LA right now by PolicyLink called Equity 2015. Equity, closing the gap, tends to sound like there's a buzzword happening in the philanthropic circuit. And foundations are responding, and some of them in a very impressive way. The Ford Foundation is reorganizing, retooling their entire grant-making program. This is the second largest foundation in the world who has come out, their leader, Darren Walker, and said that mass incarceration will be one of their main issues to tackle inequality. And so other funders are looking at racial inequality. Others are pointing to issues like economic inequality. Others are talking about gender, environmental gaps to gain social economic justice. Alex, is criminal justice reform the civil rights issue of our time? Your work with Mark Ridley Thomas now as a leader of an organization, would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Julio, and thank you to all of you who are gathered here today. Criminal justice reform, I think, is one of the many civil rights issues and moral issues that we must confront. And Children's Defense Fund California, along with many of you from California Wellness Foundation to California Community Foundation and the Endowment, Liberty Hill and others, has been able to support our work around particularly juvenile justice reform. We see it, juvenile justice reform, in a bit of a different way than some folks do. We look at children and youth from a perspective of the whole child. And I'm reminded of a nursery rhyme of a song that children sing that is describing the human skeletal framework. The bones connected to the foot bone connected to this bone, the skeletal bones connected to this. That same analogy, that same framework applies to how we ought to think about children. Children don't come in pieces. And so when we think about educational equity, we ought to be thinking about juvenile justice. When we think about poverty, we ought to be thinking about health disparities. When we think about mental health, we ought to be thinking about trauma. These things are all interconnected, they're interrelated. But we don't often fund them, we don't often view them in the same manner. We don't often view them as interconnected. We don't see the nexus between them. And if we do move in that direction, there are some specific examples that I can cite. Number one is Camp Gilpatrick replacement project, where we have looked at this $50 million project in LA County, and we have embraced an ethic of looking at the educational equity, looking at the mental health trauma, looking at the issue of art. I see Denise Grand in the audience, looking at the issue of poverty and the pipeline that brings these young people into institutions. That's an effort that we can get behind and that we can move forward, and that will have long-term results. So I think we have to look at these issues of juvenile justice, of criminal justice reform, more holistically, from early childhood education all the way down to the pipeline. If we do that, we'll be able to actually impact some catalytic change. The second point I'll make before I hand the mic back is that when we look at really the largest juvenile justice, one of the largest criminal justice entities in the nation, right here in California, in our own backyard, LA County in particular, has the largest juvenile justice system in the nation. 65% are the young men and women are Latino, 25% are African American, and African Americans represent 9% of the population in LA County. That is a moral crisis. It is a shame, but yet in our county, we have a number of progressive leaders. I've worked for one for 4 years as a senior aide on education and public safety, but we still have a calcified bureaucracy whose vision, whose thinking around this issue is a bit parochial, who do not understand that we have to think outside the box, that we have to expand our thinking around that. And so hopefully we are able to move that. We're trying to inject new policies, new programs into the thinking, but we've got to think differently. We can't do the same old things that we have always done if we want to see change in the long term.
So let me ask you a few questions, Alex, because it just made me start to think. Again, you went from government to now managing a policy advocacy organization. You've been at the helm for a year. You have a lot of foundations in this room that fund a lot of leadership development and capacity building. Can you share your experience year one running an organization, your conversations with foundations, what has surfaced, and some of the things that you are thinking about moving forward. I think it would be good for this audience to kind of hear your perspective as an executive director.
Well, Julio, year one has been, to say the least, interesting. And it has been an experience. It's probably been the greatest challenge of my life. So I've worked in a number of different sectors. I was a prosecutor when I first started. I moved into politics and policy shortly thereafter when I returned back home to LA, and now running a nonprofit. So I've seen a number of issues from a number of different perspectives. I've seen young people go into the criminal justice system. I've seen young people come out and create programs. I've seen the policy apparatus and the systems that we want to either build up or break down. And I've had the opportunity to stand on the advocacy side and push against the powers that be sometimes who may not be thinking as broadly as we want them to think. The opportunity with funders and with philanthropy has been admittedly mixed. I think we have some challenges, and this is a family conversation here. We have some challenges, but we've also had some great opportunities. We've seen some really tremendous potential, whether it's collaboratives on our juvenile justice work, whether it's looking differently at the intersection between education and justice, whether it's looking differently at the issue of poverty and really diving down into issues of local poverty and how they translate into the improvement of the quality of life of communities of color in this state. But we've still encountered barriers, frankly, Julio, in looking at issues and looking at the various areas which we pursue, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's juvenile justice, whether it's poverty, in silos. And so that conversation still needs to happen in earnest. How do we bring what is often considered disparate areas together in a way that makes sense from a funding capacity, but also programmatically and from a policy perspective. But it's been a great year. I look forward to the next many, many years with CDF California, helping to carry on the legacy of Marion Wright Edelman.
I want to thank Alex. Before we got here, I was telling all the panelists, like, you know, I've been in philanthropy for 17 years. People love to tell us what's right. That's just the nature of this work, and it's really one of the most difficult parts of this work because I think we're all interested in achieving the same thing. And so, again, I really want to tell the folks in the audience, this is not easy for them to do. And I told them to be very candid because this is about moving this work forward. And so thank you, Alex, for your insight as well as the opportunity to kind of sit here and talk about an issue that we care deeply about. And you know, we keep referencing young people and the young people and communities and families that have been impacted by institutional policies that have been in existence for a very long time. These are not things that just happen overnight. And it does include the difficult conversation when you disaggregate the data. Criminal justice is a race issue. Whether it makes you comfortable or not, it's a race issue. And so I thought it was very important to, again, really lead off the conversation with Dr. Leap and Alex to kind of give it a perspective from multiple angles, but at the same time, always really coming back to why we do this work. We invited Jessica, a young person who is an amazing advocate who has spoken out in support of reform on the juvenile justice side here in LA County. She's been partnering with a number of nonprofits, starting with InsideOUT Writers, as well as the Anti-Recidivism Coalition and the Harold Robinson Foundation, a great program that works with families and residents in South LA and provides them the space to talk about trauma and the exposure to violence. So, Jessica, you've heard Dr. Leap from UCLA, you've heard from Alex Johnson from the Children's Defense Fund. Just curious what your thoughts are and if you care to share a little bit about your story as well as the opportunities that you see moving forward.
Of course. My name is Jessica. I was formerly incarcerated youth at the age of 13 to 16, in and out. I did a year stretch. I came from a background with a mother who abandoned me and my siblings at the age of maybe 6. My father was an ex-gang member who was active at the time. So I grew up in the foster system between those ages, and I tend to lead it to the more rebellious side because I didn't have a family, I didn't belong anywhere, I never had a home. So I felt like on the streets or friends or places that could offer me a family would take me in, and that just led me into trouble. I found myself in juvenile halls, almost went to YA, which would be trialing me as an adult. So I do have a background in the juvenile justice system, and being a foster youth, that was another topic which in the system, if you are a ward of the court and then a ward of the state, you can get lost in the system, which happened to me. And that's why instead of spending 6 months, I almost spent a year in juvenile hall for not having a home and for crimes I didn't commit. I am an active member of ARC and IOW, and last month I did have the privilege to work with the Harold and Robinson Foundation, which does target at-risk youth in the Watts, Compton, South LA districts and area. And what I see the most is these young kids growing up in an area without family or without a home or without foundation or organizations, nonprofits that they lack and need. Through the organizations I work with, I did find that, and that has helped me. It inspired me, it changed the person who I used to be, and now I am here to speak for the youth or for the voiceless, because we do have so many minors who are still incarcerated, who are fighting life for crimes they had committed as a minor, and now it's jumping into adult or fighting fitness. So it gets really heavy into topic and details, but I am really glad and grateful to be here and to speak on behalf of them. Thank you.
The thing that I appreciate with Jessica is that she kind of did share before this, we had a number of phone calls that we had prior to this discussion, was really the role of those organizations and the difficulty of them finding funding to help young people re-enter after a period of incarceration. And again, if you go to any type of data set, whether it's the Foundation Center or GuideStar, and you look at organizations that are providing this service, it is a challenge for them to raise money. These are kids that we often label as, well, they're the kids that we're mad at, we're scared of, that we're afraid of. And so oftentimes, she talked about, her going from foster care to the juvenile justice system, two very desperate systems. The way we fund child welfare versus the way we fund juvenile justice. And again, Jessica, do you want to illuminate, I think you kind of mentioned this earlier about the role of ARC. You mentioned housing. Tell them a little bit about the housing portion of where you're at, as well as it's connected to you to what you mentioned earlier about employment and education. I think it's important for them to hear that.
Of course, ARC has been a part of my life. This year, it was introduced to me through IOW and InsideOUT Writers. Right away they took me in. You can become a member if you were formerly incarcerated, youth, adult, minor, it doesn't matter. If you were formerly incarcerated, they welcome you with opening arms. And the same day I was filling out my enrollment paperwork, they introduced the housing program to me, which I was desperately in the need of, coming from former foster youth, not having a stable home. I was in a really difficult situation in my life, and just to throw it out there, I am only 20 years old. I was living independently, working full-time, going to school. I had to drop out of school to work to pay for living costs, and they offered me a housing, which I am grateful for, and this allows me to go back to school. This allows me to have a social life, to be involved with my nonprofit organizations, to be actively involved and aware, and I'm in a community with other youth and adults that experience past similar to mine. So it is a great environment. When I was first released at the age of 16, sorry, not 17, I was released to my father I only knew for a few years, with no clothes, no room, no food, anything. So that was a really big issue because I wasn't an adult. I couldn't go apply to a specific job. I couldn't go get help from the government as many people because I needed a parent or I needed a co-signer. So that was a difficult issue for me. IOW, InsideOUT Writers, and ARC were there. And that has really helped me and is still helping me day to day.
Thank you for sharing that. I just want to illuminate that the project that she's mentioning is through the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. It was actually co-funded by Supervisor Yaroslavsky, as well as the Hilton Foundation, the California Endowment, and a number of other local foundations. And really, it connected the housing to education to employment. But there was also a very large policy and advocacy and organizing piece attached to it. And again, that was a public-private partnership that, again, really seeded this pilot with the idea that housing was a central part of keeping young people and adults from returning back to prison, which was a huge issue based upon a lot of the survey data. So again, it's another opportunity that government, in partnership with foundations and some donors, came together to find a solution on an issue that, again, has been surfacing quite a bit of late. So again, thank you, Jessica, for sharing that story. The two panelists to the left and to the right, Benny Torres, president of CD Tech, and Jessica Ellis from Centinela Youth Services. We have him here, again, to really provide us those examples about opportunities, because I think we've been given a lot of data today, and I think as funders and donors and other forms of philanthropy, we often get a lot of research about the issue, and then now what do we do? How do we act? What are the on-ramps? What are the opportunities? What are the new networks to do something about it? If you're an education funder, how do you connect to health? And vice versa. So let me give it to Benny and ask you, Benny, you've been an executive director for the last 5 years in South Los Angeles. Clearly, South LA has been front and center, a lot of investment from foundations. Share a little bit about how your work really connects to this larger issue around criminal justice reform. And also, I'd love, much like I asked Alex, how it's been to be the ED at an organization that's been tackling this issue around inequality for a very long time. Benny?
Thank you, Julio, for inviting me to speak, and everybody for being here. I think in terms of my 5 years as executive director or president of CD Tech, the biggest challenge has been trying to extend our message to get funders to understand the kind of work that we do and how it connects with the larger community building, community transformation agenda. I think many times people get very siloed into specific topic areas and they like to fund that. And many times philanthropy likes to frame and shape the kind of funding that and kind of topic area that people have to then adjust to. So for me, we've had some really good relationships with some funders. We'd love to be able to have more, of course. I think the issue with the philanthropy in terms of my development is we need more investment in leadership development so that we can prepare people to take on positions like I have as president of an organization. There's 650,000 people that live in South Los Angeles. There's quite a bit of organizations that do social justice, economic development work. I am one of only 2 Latinos who run nonprofits in South LA that are focused on economic justice. I think that that's part of the problem in and of itself. And Alberto Retana, who runs COCO, is the second person. And even though we've both been involved in South LA for 17, 15 years each, we are now 2 that represent leadership in South LA. And we think that that's part of the challenge. It's like, how do we develop a pipeline from folks from Los Angeles, from South LA, immigrant folks, to get into positions of power where they can affect change in their communities, where they can speak to with the kind of cultural competencies that's required, and more importantly, with the kind of black-brown bridge-building capacity that it's going to take to really help stabilize and strengthen the communities of South Los Angeles as we need so that Los Angeles as a whole can thrive. So that would be my experience in terms of that piece. So we are definitely committed to looking at the entire community, and most of our work is focused around building leadership and economic development, affecting conditions that many times plague our communities in a negative way, as you can imagine. You know all the data, you know all the statistics, but I will say that one thing that I find really intriguing is that people are not making the parallel and rethinking or redefining the criminal justice situation, are not making the parallel to economic opportunity. And what does that mean? And when we think about criminal justice or even prevention, we have about 8 grid zones that a city funds in the South LA area, and each grid zone works with about 200 young people for their contract period. Well, if you multiply 200 times 8, you get about 1,600, I think. When you think about 650,000 people, and you think about the percentage of them who are young in that category, and you think about the economic conditions that affect jobs, affordable housing, education, and the environment, you can understand why people make the choices that they make. It's not rocket science, folks, you know what I'm saying? But I think it's important that we think about how do we begin to strengthen and stabilize our communities, by investing in the human capital that exists there. We are now about, people, Julio, you mentioned the civil rights issue of this next 10 years. I think of it as what is the equity around economic opportunity as a civil rights issue for me, because when I look at South Los Angeles, and I know that people are making between $24,000 and $28,000 a year as a household, and the median average income in Los Angeles is $58,000. You think about what does that mean? You're talking about half of a population that is really, really struggling. And when you begin to look at who's going to jail, who's getting involved in the criminal justice system, it's these folks who are finding a sense of desperation, a sense of have the need to feed their family, provide rent, and things of that nature. And so we have to really look at how we're beginning to address that. For many years, we had a lot of disinvestment in low-income communities of color across the city. Now we're seeing with redevelopment a lot of change in that environment. And my concern is, how are we going to further destabilize our communities, or are we going to strengthen our communities by building and investing in human capital, building affordable housing, creating good jobs, entry-level jobs, pipelines into economic opportunity, improving our education outcomes? I mean, and it's all interconnected. And I think philanthropy has to do a better job of thinking that and being our partners in that process. How do we think this through as this whole idea of collective impact by really sitting down and building the kind of coalitions across the different sectors that it takes to begin to address the needs of our community? I think that to me is the most critical part of Los Angeles, because I think it's all interconnected and it's really having a negative impact on our most vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Benny. I appreciate that. And I think what you mentioned earlier about being one of the few Latino executive directors in South LA is very poignant. There was an article that just came out in SSIR, all these acronyms, that really talked about talent management, right? And the role that organizations are playing to incubate that future leadership from within. A lot of folks are being brought out from the outside, which is a big issue that's taking place in places like South LA. And we'll talk about that later with Jorja around folks who were recently applying for grid contracts who were indigenous to Watson, yet most of the money actually went to organizations that were outside who had more capacity and more leadership and were much more financially stable. Is that the direction that we want to head into? But we'll get back to that. Let me ask Jessica Ellis from the Centinela Youth Services. You've heard a little bit about the work that's been happening around advocacy and economic development, and hearing Jessica's journey into the foster care system and then subsequently into the juvenile justice system. You have been piloting a new program in South Los Angeles in partnership with Los Angeles Police Department to divert young people away from that system that we know further exacerbates the conditions that we're all trying to address here in this room. Can you shed a little bit of a light about the program? But more importantly, I want you to share how the program got started and who actually kind of helped you seed this work. Jessica?
Yeah, thank you all for being here. This really is an important issue, and I know it can be an intimidating one sometimes. But I want to encourage everyone here that this is the most exciting time to be doing this work. I've been working in juvenile justice and youth development for 25, 30 years, and I've never seen anything like the environment that we have now and the opportunity that we have for change. And as an example of that, the Every Child Foundation took a really unique approach to working with us on jumping on this opportunity. We finally have the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, both nationally and at the state level, saying that the way we've been doing things isn't working. And they're now supporting community justice, restorative practices. But that hasn't all filtered down into effective support at the local level. And so with the help of, and we've been doing restorative justice for 30-some years, and with the help of the Every Child Foundation, 225 women pulled together $1 million to work with us and launch a full comprehensive restorative justice center for LA. And what that took was them showing up at meetings and, poking the DA's office and the probation department and helping us make that case. We've been doing this work with phenomenal data for decades, but you all can have an amazing impact because you're seen as independent. So it's one thing for me to go in and say, look, we have the data, we're doing this work, you should be funding this. It's a whole nother thing to have Jackie Castor sitting next to me saying, we really believe in this, we're putting $1 million into this, you ought to be funding this too. And so that's a really concrete way that foundations can push this work. And one of the things I'm concerned about right now is Prop 47. The whole point is to channel more funding into doing what's more effective in criminal justice. There's a very powerful law enforcement lobby, and nothing against law enforcement. We have great friends in law enforcement, but they're coming from a single perspective, and we have data that shows that that perspective is not always working in every case. And there's a very strong lobby that wants to push how Prop 47 funds are spent. And so we all need to really stand up and push that those dollars get spent in ways and reinvested in the community in ways that are really going to be in alignment with what data shows works. And so to talk a little bit about what Jorja mentioned in terms of community justice and bringing justice back into the community. And with our kids, what happens is so many of our kids are just completely disconnected. They just get shifted around. They're in major trauma. Nobody's noticing. Nobody's doing anything about it because we've lost all sense of community. So in partnership with LAPD, we worked with them and got sign-off from the DA's office to agree to something that is really innovative. We haven't found anybody else in the state yet that's doing this. We got them to agree to put an early juvenile arrest, first, second, or third arrest if there's no serious priors, so that we can catch things early, put that arrest in abeyance while the kid comes through our highly effective diversion services, and by that we mean diverting them out of the justice system into more appropriate rehabilitative treatment. And so divert them into our services, and when they're completed, we send a letter back to law enforcement, and that arrest goes away. It does not even go on their record. And that is because of research that shows that a single arrest, even if it's never convicted, no conviction, just that one instance with law enforcement, our kids go off the rails. Their chances of graduating high school go way down. And so there's that direct connection into education. That first arrest is an indicator that there's something wrong. And we have an opportunity right there to, sure, there's definitely much more preventative things we need to be doing earlier in terms of toxic stress when they're little, and third grade, reading by the third grade. Those are two major also entry points to preventing further criminal justice activity. But that first arrest is also another key opportunity. And what we're finding with the kids that we do then an assessment of what all is going on, what we find is about a third of the kids that we're seeing on that first, second, or third arrest have serious mental health, diagnosable mental health issues. The other third, another third, serious trauma, major serious issues going on in the home. That is what is leading to this behavior. And then there's about a third, it's just dumb teenage behavior because teenagers do dumb things. So, but those 2/3 need a lot of treatment, and we can do that right then and there. But if we wait till they're in the adult justice system, we've lost our chance.
Thank you, Jessica. How many people are familiar with Prop 47? A lot. I'm not sure if you know, but part of Prop 47. Well, let me hit rewind a little bit. What's amazing about Prop 47 is that a lot of the advocates tried to go through the legislative route, and it never really got anywhere, and so they went to the ballot box. I don't know if you recall, but the LA Times did an infographic of how California was able to get Prop 47 passed in such a short amount of time, and they showed a diagram, and what was empowering to me is that it listed about 500 different entities, foundations and donors and advocates, folks from business, from research, and it really did show the opportunity for collective impact, right? That no one foundation can do this by themselves, no one nonprofit can do this by themselves, no donor can do this by themselves. And it was really illuminating to me how much energy there was on the campaign. What's been interesting is to look at when the law is, since it's been passed, that the implementation hasn't seen the same level of energy, right? And what's interesting is that this is actually where the rubber meets the road. In 4 months, there's an agency that no one knows about in Sacramento called the California Board of State and Community Corrections. There's a 12-member board. Will develop what they call an executive standing committee, which in the past used to be filled with probation and sheriff's departments, who will craft an RFP, who will then determine how $100 million will be sent back to counties. And so I say that because I think I want to just highlight what Jessica mentioned, that there's a lot of good work happening, but as funders and donors, there's still more room to really collaborate, to connect. I didn't really know any of that information if it wasn't for a lot of our advocates who says, look, the campaign's not over, it has just begun. And so, Jorja, let me bring you in and to share, and for you to share a little bit about your experience. Again, you've interfaced with quite a few folks in this room. Would love to hear your thoughts.
And this is where the rubber meets the road and the pressure is on, because all of us know that Proposition 47 is now being blamed for every possible problem going on, from the increase in the crime to global warming. It is being blamed for everything. I am a researcher. I am passionate about research, but research is not only about data. Research is about what's happening on the ground. It's a living, breathing thing. And what research has taught me as I've worked in our communities is that we are doing well, but there's a long way to go. A couple of things have happened over the past year that pushed this into stark resolve for me. The first was, as Julio mentioned, in South Los Angeles, the grid contracting process went on, and RFPs went out, and I watched in Watts, California, which is a cynosure of violence and violent activity, as we all know. There was a homegrown leader with a nonprofit who attempted to compete for a grid contract. Doesn't matter as to the details. What we all need to think about is this individual and the nonprofit organization were wholly outstripped by an outside organization that had the abilities, the credential, the infrastructure to compete very aggressively and be awarded the contract, coming from the outside, moving in. This speaks to exactly what Benny was talking about. We don't have the homegrown leaders, and this is beyond capacity building. And those of us that have seen the UCLA report about nonprofit deserts in South Los Angeles, these two forces came together, and a group of us are now organizing and getting funding to develop a nonprofit institute. And here is our revolutionary idea. We want to bring together the first cohort of community-based leaders, train them, coach them, support them, provide them resources, even things like tablets, and eventually train them so that in 2 to 3 years, they can then mentor, coach, train, sustain the next level of community leaders. If we do not have that leadership development, we are not going to have either the human capital or the human sustainability to continue. Not only does the rubber hit the road has to be made of substance, and the road has to stay there once funders leave. Because everybody in this room has also been caught in the ongoing sustainability struggle. We've got to think about real programs, real strategies. We've also got to think about new connections. Let me tell you another startling experience I had. At UCLA, I got an email because there was going to be a new student, a new undergraduate, who had been formerly incarcerated. And there was a tremendous brouhaha about this one student, this one undergraduate that UCLA wanted to support. And everybody got so excited because UCLA was behind this one student. And I said, and by the way, ironically, the one student is a man named James Anderson, who's part of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. And while UCLA, who I dearly love, was breaking its hand, patting itself on the back, I said, why aren't there more? And we do have the Opportunity Institute. in partnership with the Stanford Criminal Justice Institute, with Vera, that are working to put together an initiative that is called Pathways to Prison to Higher Education. UCLA should not be sending me emails about one student. They should be sending me and other academics emails about 100 students, because this is an important place, just like building the community leaders is an important place, just like supporting initiatives like Bloom out of CCF, which foresaw a problem 3.5 years ago, is an important place, which is like a window between worlds, and what's being done at Centinela Youth Services in terms of addressing trauma. We are all in this together, but we've got to talk about real programs, real efforts, and sustaining and building leaderships where there have to be deserts that bloom, and there have to be youth like Jessica that are going to mentor and support youth in the future. Yes, Jessica Ellis made a very important point. Foundations are independent, and foundations are leading the innovation. But we also have to talk about concrete programs, building infrastructure, developing those human leaders, that human capital, and P.S., by the way, having relevant research, not a bunch of tallies made, not outcomes only, but relevant research that helps build these efforts.
Thank you, Jorja, with no passion whatsoever. Speaking of passion, if people have been reading the newspapers, and I'm going to bring it up because it needs to be brought up, because I do think it touches this issue. Recently, this question is for Benny, LA Times, and actually I want Alex to weigh in as well. Eric Garcetti held a town hall in South Los Angeles about obviously what the recent increase in violence, and was met with folks from the community who wanted him to really talk about the core issues of what's been taking place, not just this year, but what's been there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Can you weigh in on that, Benny, and really shed light around, as a funder, you read things like that, like, tell us a little bit about that process. I think you were actually at that meeting, but really highlight the opportunity that exists.
Julio wants to get me in trouble.
Calling you out.
I am a very proud city commissioner, so, Mayor Garcetti did reappoint me, so this might be my goodbye. Farewell tour. I was there. I was there for the latter part of the meeting, and I think part of the challenge, and first of all, I hope people understand that there's more to the story than what you're reading in the paper, and I hope that you understand that there is a strong effort to villainize Black Lives Matter because of their tactics and their message and their approach, and I think it's unfair to do that without understanding the context of what's been going on all summer with Black Lives Matter and their attempts to reach out and meet with the mayor around the policing policy in Los Angeles, about their concerns around the police commission's appointments, about their concerns about how Chief Beck has handled the situation, primarily with Ezel Ford in South LA last August and other situations like that. And I think we have to understand that politicians and politics play out in a lot of this place. It is clear that the mayor has had a challenged time in terms of connecting with the African-American community of South LA. South LA is big. There's not one African-American community. There's a lot of people in South LA that are African-American, and there's an old guard of leadership and there's a new guard of leadership. There's progressive folks and there's folks who've had a long-term establishment relationship with the mayor's office. Not Garcetti in particular, but going all the way back to the Bradley days. And so it's important to understand that I think that what happened that Monday was a very poorly planned event. It was sent out to me as, hey, South LA leaders, come out and hear a town hall with the mayor about the conditions that are going on in South Los Angeles. In that situation, I assumed that they meant myself as someone who works in South Los Angeles and runs an organization and does a lot of leadership development and training. So I invited all my students to show up to the church. We actually even ended class a little early to try and get there to hear about the dialogue. as I got there and I entered the room, I saw that 95% of the population in that space were African Americans. And I didn't see South LA reflected as I know South LA, which is a little bit more of a mix. And then I realized that what was going on was that the meeting was called in a way to kind of say neutralize the Black Lives Matters movement and make it more of a broader conversation. And I think what upset Black Lives Matter is that they had been requesting a meeting with the mayor in the entire summer, and instead of just having that meeting, because I think even if you don't agree with Black Lives Matter, they're a strong movement that's worked really hard to bring a national issue and a local issue together. And as mayor, I think it's important that we sit out and listen to what they have to say. You don't have to agree, you don't even have to make a decision that they want, but I think everybody who's been working hard and organizing and advocating to bring this issue to the forefront, to the point where even, President Obama's talking about this, it's important that you sit down and give them that respected dialogue. And that didn't happen, and so as a result, you had what you saw that Monday night. And now, unfortunately, the issue has been taken away from what Black Lives Matters is talking about, and everyone's talking about these thugs and Black Lives Matter. And let me tell you that there is PhDs in Black Lives Matter, there are doctors, there are lawyers, there are students, there are elders, there are young folks. They make up all walks of life in South LA and across the country. And so let's hope that going forward, we're able to see the difference between the political maneuvering of these situations and really not lose sight of what Black Lives Matter is talking about, one, and two, also talk about the conditions in South Los Angeles and what the city needs to do, like I said, going back to what I talked about earlier, is in really investing in building human capital, building the infrastructure, and building the community dynamics and the conditions that help create a community and make it come to whole. So that's really my take of what happened with that meeting. And like I said, let's keep our eyes on the prize, which is we still have to address the issues that Black Lives Matter is bringing forward, and at the same time also address the relationship that the mayor's office has to have with African Americans in South LA and all of the people that live in South LA as well.
Yeah, and I bring that up because, again, it touches on a lot of different issues, because after what took place, a lot of folks reached out to foundations to say, can you fund a space so that folks can come together? A lot of the organizers were saying, we just don't get any funding for this issue because it's just very uncomfortable. And again, it's not like they don't want the best intention for what's taking place in South LA. Everybody wants good jobs, a clean environment, safe neighborhoods. And so I bring that up because, again, it was something that we had been getting a lot of calls on around where foundations invest, right? We invest in advocacy, we do the data, we do the research, and yet people were asking us, could we create a space for community and government to come together? Was there an opportunity to fund a lot of, because this is a marathon when you talk about really looking at issues that have been there for a very long time. Alex, I kind of want to bring you in, again, really back to you running CDF. You mentioned some of the interactions with foundations. You've heard a little bit about what Jorja kind of talked about, the opportunities moving forward. What are the three things that you can offer the folks in the room as an on-ramp for, again, a very complex issue that has many underlying factors but many different solutions? What kind of recommendations do you have for the folks in the room?
Let me first say that to Benny's point, I agree. Let me go a step further and say that what happened in South LA recently, what is taking place in the conversation with Black Lives Matter, is this rage that is taking place, and it's rooted really in young people. It's generational, it's cyclical, but the underlying import of that rage is that there's not enough action taking place. So a couple of things that come to mind and framed around this conversation of rethinking criminal justice. Jorja mentioned it, and Julio mentioned it. We've got to put more focus on the Board of State and Community Corrections. That is a body where there are tens of millions of dollars coming through, whether it's for Prop 47, whether it's for juvenile justice reform, and yet it's a body that's comprised of individuals whose thinking may not necessarily be aligned with the best practices that are providing results in juvenile justice reform. So you have individuals who are primarily law enforcement, and then there's Scott Butnick and one other person on that panel. Scott needs help. And we've got to be able to support the efforts at advocacy at BSCC. CDF is doing that in many ways, thanks to the support of some of our partners. Number two, we've got to look at how do we apply the new LCFF funding, the protections in LCFF, to our youth who are often considered the disposable youth, who are considered the throwaway youth. How do we get an increase on the protections? I carry another hat. I'm on the LA County Board of Education, and so I see these young people. I visit camps, I visit halls, and we need to be unsatisfied with just simply adequacy. We need to be unsatisfied with that. And we've got to advocate more, we've got to push more in Sacramento and across the state for greater protections, greater investments in those youth who are foster youth, who are homeless youth, who are facing this systematic, complex trauma in their lives. They need more support, school counselors, et cetera. And that support isn't just in institutions, it's not just in probation camps, it starts in the school environment as well. And we're not providing them with the resources they need there, then what else are they going to do but wind up in the school to prison pipeline? And then thirdly, Julio said three, thirdly, this is just something that stands out to me as most important. We have to invest early. We often talk about why these young people are there. There are a variety of reasons that we cannot disaggregate from the conversation: poverty, educational neglect, et cetera. But it starts early, and so I raise the point, I make the argument that early childhood education is fundamental. If you look at the outcomes, if you look at all the metrics and the indicators that attach to early childhood education and its alignment with juvenile justice, with criminal justice, a child who has been given an opportunity in preschool, in kindergarten, and that 0 to 5 age, given those opportunities, those concrete, high-quality early childhood education, not just babysitting, the outcomes on the back end are going to be greater. So more access to jobs, more access to education, to higher education, less interaction, if at all, with the criminal justice system. The outcomes are there. We see them. We know them. We just got to invest in them. So I continue to, and I see Casey raise her hand. This is not the revival, but I see Casey raising her hand in the back. We've got to invest in that. We've got to be thoughtful about how we create that narrative that investing early, investing in the front end means we don't have to invest in the back end. So those are three concrete points that I'd make.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to bring Jessica back into this conversation because, again, I know oftentimes we will talk about things that you've actually lived through and have been, you still continue to be impacted by. Again, just really want to check in with you. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking about based upon what's been said today about where to invest, some of the challenges around this issue that we're calling criminal justice, but yet education and housing? If you were, in a position to support some of this work, where would you have started?
I would say Alex made a great point, starting early, because as growing up young, I wasn't sure where my future would lie or end, if I was going to live another day, be homeless or not, because once again, I didn't really have a family. So I was on my own. To have that support in school would have made a bigger impact, because growing up with a very strong family who comes from a past of violence and substances, you're not shown to be vulnerable or be emotional or be soft or seek help. You're toned and taught to be tough, to be strong, to not open up to others. So it's hard when later on in your adulthood life, you're being asked these questions on, oh, how did this make you feel, or what did you go through? In some cases, and with some youth or adults now, it's hard to speak about that because we weren't privileged, or we weren't shown how to do that at a young age. When I first came out, I did have a few problems because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know I needed to go to school. I didn't know I needed to maybe start working. I was so lost, so I got back in trouble, and that's how I eventually wound back inside juvenile hall. But I guess to speak on some of the nonprofit organizations, IOW, InsideOUT Writers, did create an alumni program, which is basically what they do in their work is they go inside the juvenile halls and camps and create a writing class, a writing circle. Pretty much it's art, expression through words, poetry, whatever you want to call it. It was basically rec in juvenile halls or in camps, which you do not get besides going outside for an hour or two there the whole day. It made a great impact because once I was released, they did tell me there is an alumni program which reaches out to formerly incarcerated youth and gives them that foundation, that help, that assistance, that support, what most youth need, because when you're released back into your family's foster home or wherever you're getting sent back home to, you need some type of structure, some type of foundation. You need a family, and you need to be shown what's right and wrong, even though, yes, it's all morals. Everyone should know this, but it's really hard if you weren't exposed to this at a young age. So,
Thank you, Jessica, for really putting that personal touch. I think sometimes we get caught up in the nuance of research and data and outcomes, and we forget about the humanity, right? So, yes, always apologizing for Dr. Leap. Jessica Ellis, again, I would love to know, you kind of shared a little bit about the program. Can you share with the audience where you're at this point? You talked about its effectiveness, but where do you go from here? Obviously this is, a program that's been effective, but at the same time, I'm curious about the funding mechanism and just how you see this, if it's a pilot, how does it get scaled and all that good stuff?
Well, we've been doing this effectively for 4 years, so we're officially not calling it a pilot anymore. I think the challenge, so what we're doing is bringing the justice piece back into the community. So we have members of the community that come in and are trained as mediators. They go through 50 hours of intensive training. And they volunteer their time to sit down with our kids and the victim of their crime. So we're doing real accountability. And that's an important piece, I think, that often gets lost when we're talking about diversion or rehabilitation, is we focus only on the person who committed the act. And sometimes just really forget the victim side of this. And there's a benefit to both. For the person who committed the act to be able to make things right is a huge part of that healing and being able to reconceptualize themselves moving forward in their future, because they've been able to clean up their past. And being able to do that directly to the person that you harmed or the entity that you harmed is very powerful. And it's really powerful for the victims, and often these are one and the same. A lot of our victims are other kids, or most of our kids that we see for offending have been victimized very seriously. So, this is all in the same community. My own family I have someone in my family was murdered, and I have 2 very close family members spent time in the prison system. Like, we're all the same. And so we need to solve this together. And so I think that linkage between victims and offenders is always completely disconnected, and it needs to come back together. And that's part of community justice and healing. And so we've been doing that and showing these great outcomes, but we would love to, this can be the way that juvenile justice is handled. New Zealand, decades ago, changed their system so that all kids that could qualify under certain circumstances, basically most offenses, with the exception of murder, would go to restorative justice in the community first before going into the justice system. So we can do that. And so our challenge has been, and just going back to the BSCC and the way we fund our counties, there's automatic funding allocations that go to our justice system, and there's no real outcomes tied to them. You can't look up on probation's website what our recidivism rates are for different programming. And I know there's been pushing with the BSCC to tie those public dollars to at least some basic outcomes like recidivism, and there's resistance in doing that. So, but then you have community-based programs that are proven to work and dramatically lower recidivism, are getting hardly any public dollars. Or we have to go apply ourselves to the state, and we've gotten a lot of state grants because of our success. we're doing our justice system better than our public entities are sometimes, and how do we have a conversation as a community about where we invest our public dollars? And I think that's where you all can have some real influence on that.
Again, really want to thank you for that last point. And I think that kind of begs the larger question that there's a very large strategy, no one really owns it. I think as a foundation, it's always great to be cognizant of that full continuum, right? So as Alex mentioned, there's a lot of work focused on the front end, keeping people out of these very systems that we've been talking about, but at the same time, never forgetting those that are in the system and helping them transition back home. Jorja mentioned an opportunity that is taking place in the next few months that the Ford Foundation is leading called California Pathways, and there's a number of foundations here in this room that have done a lot of work around advocacy and organizing. It's a $30 million endeavor, and it's to increase the number of in-custody education programs, which currently don't exist in 33 prison facilities in California. And so again, that's a new opportunity that the Ford Foundation has really launched here in California that really looks at that full continuum, right, helping people transition back home, especially for men and women. And so I'm going to open up the discussion because I do think it's important to kind of hear from the audience, to ask questions of our experts on this panel, to really think about what is the action moving forward. We go to a lot of events, we hear a lot of things, but what can we really do? So I want to open it up to the audience, and so we'll take the first question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you guys so much. This was so informative and very helpful. My name is Casey Patterson. I'm with the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment, Funders Collaborative focused on early childhood outcomes for kids 0 to 5 in LA County. My question is specific to Prop 47 and whether or not the dollars that are being decided at the state level already have prescription in terms of what are the preventative or intervention methods that they are looking to fund, and what opportunity, if any, exists to invest some of those dollars in the early years, specifically reducing toxic stress for children 0 to 5, or specifically looking at ways to actually open up more access and opportunities for early childhood development and education, and if Prop 47 dollars is a viable mechanism to do that.
Let me preface it by saying, right now, the BSCC is putting a committee together to comprise the RFP, to literally write the RFP for those facets of how the funds will be spent. And it's an interesting thing because in terms of outreach, who is going to be on that committee to write the RFP? And I was fortunate enough that Julio sent me the notice and I threw my hat into the ring, but how many of us have Julios in our lives where they will tell us what to do, which is also one of the roles of the foundations. So that RFP is being written as we speak. The concern is it is badge heavy, that a lot of the forces writing it will be involved in law enforcement and or probation. But Julio knows more specifics.
Let me make a correction. The RFP is not being worked on just yet. The next step for the Prop 47 is an executive standing committee. So they will name 2 co-chairs at their next meeting, which is in November. So they will choose 2 board members to lead the effort. Then they will ask an open call for experts on mental health, trauma. There's a funding formula for Prop 47. I believe 70% of it is for mental health, substance abuse, and housing. And then there's also money for Department of Education for school expulsion, school discipline. And then there's also, I believe, a small percentage for victims of crime, trauma, et cetera. But again, it's a very, very wonky exercise. Trust me, I've been going to these meetings for 3 years, and there was 4 people in the audience who really cared about it. Now, again, with the help of other foundations, including the California Endowment, Rosenberg Foundation, Sierra Health, California Community Foundation, you now have organizers and advocates that are attending every meeting. There's an issue. They're monitoring the process moving forward, which, again, I get it. It's not the sexy part of this work, but think about the opportunity to influence how $100 million, at minimum $150 million, will go back into community, because one of the things we're asking is that the money don't go just to county departments, but also to service providers in those regions.
I was interested to know more about the work that you're doing in leadership
Sure. Thank you. In South LA, one of the biggest things for us is to invest in building leadership, and so we have a couple of different ways that we do it. We run an education and training program at LA Trade Technical College. We offer a certificate and an AA degree in community planning and economic development, and it's the only one of its kind that exists west of the Mississippi. Actually, only one of its kind that exists in the United States that actually gets folks into 3 tracks. You go to the program to either take the knowledge, tools, and skills around organizing and leadership and community planning to affect change in your neighborhood. 2, you take the skills and you go find a job in the nonprofit sector or in government. Or 3, you get your A and transfer to a 4-year university so that then you can pursue your master's degree and become a planner and actually work in the community. So we have that program. And those classes look just like our South LA community. As a matter of fact, the folks who have been the most successful in the program recently are folks who have done up to 20 years in prison and have come out and have been a part of the program, because for many years they feel that they were destroying their community or being part of a negative part of a community, and now they want to help heal or they want to transform their neighborhood, and they're learning these skills and being effective and working in their neighborhood. We do that program. We also run a Public Allies program, which is an AmeriCorps-funded program, which is intended, and I use it as a workforce development, leadership development program, because it's intended to get folks into the nonprofit sector. And so we recruit every year about 35 to 40 young folks, and not so young folks, from inner city Los Angeles, primarily South Los Angeles, and have them work for 10 months in a nonprofit. And on top of that, they get a stipend, they get money for college, and they also go through leadership development training for those 10 months, as well as take classes at LA Trade Tech College to build their skills and their tools. We have a VISTA program as well. And what we have found is that when we talk about investing in leadership, this is the only way we can do it. One of the things that we need to do better is invest more time into building human capital, right? So I'll give you a story. Stephen Love is a young man from Watts. Because he lived in Jordan Downs, went to Jordan High School, was associated with the Jordan neighborhood kind of gang activity. So anytime something happened, they would blame all the kids from the Jordan Downs housing project. He was kicked out, sent to lock. The day he went to lock, the first day of school, the principal pulled him out and said, "Oh, well, you're from Jordan Downs, I can't have you at Locke High School." So then he was basically kicked out of that school, ended up going, fortunately for him, he took the initiative, went to Youth Build and got his GED. After Youth Build, he understood this, he heard about this AmeriCorps thing and how this is, this opportunity, youth-focused investment. So he went from there, he applied to our Public Allies program. He did our first year where he learned about community engagement and civic engagement and participation in ways of going out to communities and connecting people with resources that are available. He was able to then stabilize his income. He was making a $15,000 stipend, which for his household, where he had 2 brothers in jail, 1 brother had been killed, and 2 younger brothers underneath him, was pretty stabilizing for the family. He then became a second-year Public Ally, where he then became a supervisor and began to train other individuals, high school kids, as well as our community planning trade tech students, on how to engage residents in the community, engage them in community building practices and organizing. This year, I hired him full-time. He's making $35,000 a year, a 24-year-old man who, he told me straight out, "Benny, I made more money than this on the street. I've agreed to transform my life and transform that of my community." And the 4 years of investment in these kind of public and nonprofit kind of partnerships, saying, "Hey, we're committed to Stephen for 4 years," has now led him to a full-time stable job. And I've told Stephen, "Hey man, I want you to take my job. I want you to have my job," because somebody from South Central Los Angeles who grew up in South Central Los Angeles has to run these types of organizations. And you should have seen his face, how excited he was, because he knows we've made a commitment to him. So that's how, in my opinion, leadership development and workforce development and community economic transformation have to work together. So I can give you stories and stories, but I think it's important that we provide that human element, the very real situation. And the last thing I'll say is we do a workforce training program that's tied to the redevelopment projects that are happening in South LA that we're fighting for opportunity. He just got his 2 young brothers to sign up, and they started the training program themselves. So they're all on a pathway, to really transform their lives. And the last thing I'll say is that not all men that come out of prison need to do construction jobs, okay? We have people who are very talented, bright, that can come into the nonprofit sector. We need more nonprofits to hire local people from that community that they're serving. And U.S. philanthropy can help, because you're good at telling us what to do sometimes. And one thing you can be really good at telling us what to do is to say, if I'm going to give you this grant to service a certain community that's low income, you need to hire a certain percentage of people from that population, because you'll see better service production and you'll see better transformation of people's lives, and you'll stabilize that economy a lot faster than any program you could fund.
Hi, my question's for Jorja. You had said earlier, first of all, you talked about there being so many women in the room. And second of all, you talked about the fact that the window to have real impact is closing fast. Can you explain that a little bit? Talk about that a little bit more?
I think this is the moment, and I think I'll be blunt with you. Unfortunately, we sort of live and die by the crime rate. And what concerns me is, as we see the spikes in the crime rate, which doesn't really indicate a rise, that there will be a backlash. And this concerns me. And we sort of had a precursor with the reaction to Black Lives Matter and not understanding the substance of that movement. The moment is here now. And I think that the window, it's not closing abruptly, it's closing slowly. But I think we've got to take full advantage and really do things in a concrete and an intentional way. Next year, as we all know, is the presidential election. It is a wild card. I'd like to believe I could tell you how it's going to turn out. I'm always afraid of a backlash. And I think that we need to put programs, infrastructure, advocacy, all of these into place as soon as possible. We are all aware of what is needed, whether it's early childhood intervention, trauma, investing in reentering populations, all of these. And by the way, males as well as females, okay? So we now have to move because this is subject to change. I can tell you that in Chicago, where crime is spiking, where crime is not only spiking, it's out of control, no one is talking about these types of programs. They are talking about enforcement and suppression. So I think we need to be thoughtful, we need to be intentional, and I don't believe we have an unlimited amount of time.
Hi, I'm Eileen Adams. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have the microphone? Oh, okay. I have the microphone. This is a question for Jessica Ellis, who described, such an important program, a community justice program which keeps kids out of the system by providing them with wraparound services and victim offender mediation opportunities. Can you describe what exactly your outcome data shows and how that compares to other systems?
Sure, and I have a handout with all of that on the resource table up at the center, so you're welcome to take that, and it'll be part of, I think, what they send afterwards. So we did a comparison study. There was an outside evaluator did a comparison study with our a little while back, looking at a cohort of kids that had all been referred into our program, so they were all the same in that sense in terms of the way they were viewed by the referring agencies. And then one cohort went to mediation with their victim, and the comparison group was unable to go to mediation with their victim because the victim was unavailable or uninterested. So those kids went back into whatever the normal system would be. Vast majority would be informal probation, most likely. Some would end up going on formal probation. And in that particular study, the kids going through the normal system had a recidivism rate of 31% after 1 year. So they were rearrested for new misdemeanors or felonies at a rate of 31%, and our kids at 15%. When we ran our recidivism rate on our kids last year, it was down to 8%. So we sort of fluctuate between 8 and 11% typically. And of the community service hours, they were either ordered in the system, or in our system, it was as part of the agreement that they would negotiate together with the victim. Our kids completed their community service hours at 6 times the rate than if it was ordered. Because now there's a real meaning behind it, and there's a human connection about why I'm doing this. And then restitution was off the charts. And we were looking at this because we know that restitution can really be a hardship for families. They're not only having to pay the victim, they're having to pay also $100 just into the general restitution fund, plus all kinds of other fees. And most of our families are low income, so in the system, there's a lot of costs put on them. It also turns out it's really not collected, is what we found out. And there's no consequences. So we're sending the wrong message there too. So our kids were paying back restitution to their victims at a rate that was 166 times higher than if they were going through the system. But we saw victims coming way down. Most of the times they'd be like, oh, okay, single mom, 3 kids, I don't need money, pull your grades up. They would get it really creative, really reasonable. But if there was real damage, then there would be a conversation about, well, how can this young person really earn it so it's not just an added burden on mom or dad? And so they would talk through, concrete ways to earn it back and be meaningful about it.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question because we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Yes, last question.
These are all wonderfully enlightened leaders on this issue, and a lot of the programs that are working are dependent on organizations like the District Attorney's Office, the Probation Department, and law enforcement. And sometimes they have enlightened leadership too, but the rank and file isn't always thinking innovatively about criminal justice. So what kind of training is being provided to these folks?
Just a quick shout out to the Amundsen Foundation, who just helped us with a grant to do just that, to develop more training for law enforcement, school personnel. A lot of our kids the arrest is initiated at the school. We should have a whole session on what schools are doing with kids. So they're helping us do training in all levels of the justice system.
One of the things that we've seen, particularly with probation department officers and teachers from the county offices of education and teachers in districts across the state, has been through our Freedom Schools program, which is a summer literacy program. A few years back, we put it into our probation camps in LA County and in Alameda County. And so Freedom Schools is a national program in California. We had last year about 2,200 students who participated across 31 sites, 32 in California, 2 in Seattle. But 7 of those sites were solely focused in our juvenile institutions. And so and the probation officers and the teachers are leading that program. So it's a literacy-focused program. They're leading the curriculum. They're working with these young people, particularly this population of young people in those juvenile institutions. Before they even get to that point, they're going to a training that we do every year in Haley Farm in Tennessee, where they are literally indoctrinated with what it means to be a child of poverty, what it means, what are the racial implications, what are the ways of dealing with trauma, what is trauma. And so one of the things, and I'll leave you with this, we sought to do that program, and I worked to start it before I joined when I was working in the county. We sought to do that program not solely for the literacy impact and the behavior impact. We've seen literacy rates go up significantly. We've seen class restructures go down about 55%, racialized violence go down significantly, behavior incidents during the course of that program were down significantly. But what we saw was an opportunity to inject a culture change in the mindset of 2 very institutionalized county departments in the largest probation system in the nation. And one of the things that just warmed my heart and made this all clear, it's not what you can really measure, is one of the probation officers, a guy named Lamar Ruffin, who had done the training for 2-3 years and had been one of the leaders at Camp Afro-Blah in LA County in the Santa Monica Mountains area. He decided that he wanted to go and teach and that he could make a different impact, not just as a probation officer, but he could take that sort of ethos and apply it to being a teacher. So he went and got his substitute teacher's license. He's written a book. He's going back and inspiring kids. That's the type of change that is engendered. And it's not always going to be the same old type of trainings that probation does, hundreds and hundreds of trainings. But it's what's the right training for these officers and these teachers to have that allows them to really connect with these young people who are coming from backgrounds of horrible trauma And Officer Ruffin is one such individual. There are countless others who've done this training that CDF does that are on a different pathway and are enlightened.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah,
Quickly.
real quick, we're working with Los Angeles Police Department's Newton Division with Captain Rodriguez. He asked us to come in and provide training on the cultural context of South LA to his new and transfer cops that are coming in as a result of the spike in violence in the area. And so we thought it was really important to identify what the history of the community is, what the kind of public health concerns and issues are that folks are dealing with, and also to help address some of the systemic issues and also build some kind of human relationships between the community-based organizations and the police officers in the area. So we're doing that at the division level.
Thank you. Please join me for giving the panel a round of applause.